everybody, or in fact, good afternoon. So delighted to welcome my panel. We've got voters going to the polls in India, the United States, Mexico, South Africa, European Union parliamentary elections, and of course, here in the UK. These elections are taking place in a world in which uncertainty seems to be the only certainty. In fact, according to the World Economic Forum, geopolitical volatility is seen as the biggest risk this year by chief risk officers. So what does that environment all mean for financial services and for FinTech? We've got some fantastic folks on stage for you. We have the Managing Director, Head of Digital Finance at the Institute of International Finance, Jessica Renier. Thank you for coming. How are you?
Good, great. Good to be here.
Good. We've got the UK FinTech leader at EY, Chris Woolard. Chris, how are you?
Very well, thanks.
Good to see you. All right, and also the co-founder and executive chairman of H Advisors Cicero, and relevant for our conversation, author of an independent report, A New Partnership, a long-term plan for government-business relations to power our economy and society. And he authored that for the Labour Party. That was published 2 months ago now. That is Iain. So Iain, tell us what the election you're particularly watching is this year.
Well, I watch all elections. Anyone that knows me, Edie, knows I'm a political geek. So it's a bit difficult to know which way to look first. So I kind of want to say America, but
right.
I'm going to say the UK, not least because we're in London. And actually, think about your working life in this country, we only seem to make a fundamental change about once every 14, 15 years. So I'm watching the UK.
All right, great. Chris, you've previously worked at the Financial Conduct Authority, the Bank of England, FSB, but you can't choose the UK elections because Iain snaked that one. So what's the election you're particularly watching this year?
So on the basis that Iain's already snagged it, the other one I think is well worth looking at is Europe. Because, not only will we have change of parliament, we'll have a change of commission, and I think, we're really at a crossroads moment here. There is a pivot, there is this much greater interest in defence. We may see a slight shift to the right, or maybe even a bigger shift to the right. What that does in terms of that European agenda, I think will fundamentally shape, a very significant part of the world.
Interesting. Okay, so Jessica, you live in DC. You've worked with the Office of Management and Budget in the Executive Office of the President. I'm imagining you're watching the U.S. elections.
It's a good imagination. Yes, certainly in DC, quite familiar with the U.S. elections. I think coming into November, and we'll see where those play out. I think much of the world is watching the U.S. elections. But I think getting into kind of our conversation around finance too today, I think one of the questions we'll need to ask ourselves about each one of these elections is what issues will we be looking at that are actually impacted by an election and by politics as much as issues that will continue to move forward regardless of an administration. And I think technology really plays a big role there because technology continues to move forward and national security issues continue to move forward and oftentimes have consistency regardless of a political leaning in one way or the other.
Okay, we'll come back to that. Let's talk about geopolitical risk. Kristen, I mentioned it at the top. Elections are part of that, of course, and the landscape for fintechs has dramatically changed in the last 10 years. Doesn't seem like we're going to have a very peaceful few years to come. We seem to have more war. We have more regionalism. We have less globalization. I like to call it the tsunami of crises, seems to be building up one after another. But pick through this. What's important, do you think, to pay attention to?
Yeah, I think when we're talking sort of geopolitics, it can seem very distant very quickly. It's something that you see on your TV. If you're a founder, you're trying to run a fintech, you're trying to take it through a sort of growth phase. There's far more immediate things to worry about in terms of your customers and business planning, revenue, all of those sorts of things. And it can feel like, okay, if you're running a global bank, maybe that's on the agenda for the board tomorrow, but not for me. But the reality is, it shapes so much of the operating environment for fintech. So, you've already referred to sort of 10 years ago. We were in a world where there was a pretty tried and tested model, and the UK benefited from this hugely, which was you have a great idea, you see it through to fruition, you then, usually either in the US or the UK as your launch pad, and then you're thinking about how do I take this global? And actually the environment you're in at that stage was pretty benign, frankly. I think now, we are seeing that set of global tensions. One, it has an immediate economic effect. It's driving some of the things that we can see in the wider economy. But also, if you are thinking about operating internationally, it's become a much, much tougher environment. It requires much more nuance. And we can certainly see, I think, amongst the regulators and, those are the people that, as an authorised firm, you're going to deal with day to day, actually that pressure seeps through to how some countries are choosing to organise themselves far more on national or regional lines now. So that environment for doing business is just becoming that much more tough and difficult to negotiate.
Interesting. So, Iain, it's looking increasingly likely, like we're going to see a Labour government here in the UK, but Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves don't look like they're about to go on a massive spending spree. That has implications, of course, for public services, for our NHS, for infrastructure. Is there a role that you would like financial services, and specifically FinTech, to play?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons why I entitled my report for Labour a new partnership is that, look, we haven't exactly had a benign politics, to say the least, in this country for the last few years.
You mean given the number of prime ministers, chancellors, business secretaries?
5 prime ministers, 9 business secretaries, 7 chancellors, and a partridge in a darn pear tree, frankly. So, look, I mean, we heard it actually from one of our unicorns earlier this morning. What are we after? I'm privileged as well to sit around the Innovate Finance board table. What do we want? People want predictability and certainty in terms of policy. They want to know what the UK stands for, what is brand UK about, and then I think there's an opportunity for people to invest. Now, to your question, I have an ambition for more of the sector, and it's one of the reasons why Innovate Finance has been doing this work, Edie, around serving the underserved parts of our communities, to lean into that. Now, if this is going to be a Labour government, Labour has talked about a sandbox for the underserved. That's one of the keynote ideas that's there within financing growth. There's a lot of people in this room thinking about payments. There's a lot of people in this room thinking about other parts of the ecosystem. I think there is an opportunity, if we are going to see that change for the first time in 14, 15 years, to start to think really about how you light up this democratization of finance idea. To be fair, parts of the ecosystem do this incredibly well. I think parts of this ecosystem are not quite there yet.
Like
and
what?
I think that's what a new government looks to see. So like what? We've seen lots on payments, helping people through the cost of living crisis. There's probably a real opportunity for InsurTech to lean in, for those thinking about how we fund health systems ahead, how we fund and how the savings gap comes together to make these things happen. I think there's a big opportunity for the sector to lean into that.
So a big opportunity within savings and filling the savings gap.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly.
Great. So, Jessica, with more or with less globalization comes more protectionism. So from a financial services, from a FinTech perspective, why does that matter?
Anything that inhibits the free flow of information and data is is typically negative for financial services and just for globalization as a whole. And I do think that as we look at the elections as they come up, I think the world is marching more towards a protectionist stance in many ways than back towards a more globalized stance, which is going to be detrimental, particularly if you think about the development of artificial intelligence and a lot of advanced technology right now. AI draws on data, right? And it learns from data, it trains on data. So if we think about the patchwork of data policies that we have around the world right now that have been created, each in their own vacuum, some in different jurisdictions for protectionist reasons, others just out of differences in privacy requirements or perspectives from one country to another, that patchwork has not been kind of put together yet to see what quilt gets made. And then AI then draws on the pieces of that patchwork when it's applied. And we don't know what that will look like yet. So I do worry a bit about the direction of protectionism that it seems like we're moving in. But then I do think that at some point we will reap what we've sown from a range of data protection and data policy and data sharing policies that haven't all been thought about together to work together.
Chris, do you want to talk at all about that, about protectionism, how we might see that growing? Do you see the same kind of fears around data and AI?
Yeah, so I mean, I think if you look around the world, there have been a number of countries that have deliberately adopted policies around how they handle data that are very much driven towards an industrial strategy for that country.
Give me an example.
So probably good example from sort of 2 or 3 years ago is India. You know, and we've seen you know, a very deliberate policy shift that says, as this enormous country develops, as its financial services sector develops, then you know that is going to be an industry that's processed on the shore largely, that is going to operate, you know, very much as an Indian industry for Indians, and that's clearly the choice of the Indian government and the Indian people. But you then sort of look at how that interfaces with a number of global companies, and you can see the rubbing points and the sticking points quite quickly.
What are those sticking points?
Well, so I mean, it's the question of, you know, the ability to do business easily across global systems. How far do you have to serve an individual market? Now, I think, you know, for many of those international banks and payments firms, actually you're looking at a market that's so vast, then that adaptation is possible. When you begin to scale that down, though, and you think about that happening market by market around the world, that's when you really, I think, get into some of the friction that Jessica was just talking about. I think there's also, you know, we can see, despite the fact it's probably the global issue, if we look at sustainability, you know, although many things stem from CFTC and those kind of international agreements, the reality is there are some very, very different ways all sorts of different bits of the world have decided to try and implement what ostensibly looks like the same thing. And again, you know, if you're a firm trying to operate across those boundaries, if you're trying to provide international finance, then clearly that friction is there.
Did you want to come in on that, Iain?
Yeah, so coming back to Chris's pick on the European elections, you know, the regardless of the outcome, left or right, I think this is a bit like the protectionism point that Jessica was making earlier. I mean, this is regardless of a left or right thing anymore. This is happening. And, you know, Europe is talking about having a specific digital commissioner in the next phase, having a digital committee in the European Parliament. So the focus on the sector is going to kind of ramp up alongside reviews of good old GDPR and other things along the way. Potentially a Digital Fairness Act coming out of Europe as well for us to get our head around. But I was in a conversation too, just sort of broadening it out a bit, Edie, when I kind of roll out my report here in the UK, because I talked in that report about the role of the systemic regulators, and I spoke to some of those regulators in the midst of my review. And my conclusion there is that there needs to be a dialogue between head of government, in this case, Prime Minister, Chancellor, Business Secretary, about the landscape for doing business in our country. And I know that's something that people in this room care about a lot. And after I reported, I sat down with one of those regulators, and they said to me something rather interesting, which was politicians need to decide the level of risk, therefore opportunity, and there is threat, of course. Chris, you know that, having been a regulator, but the level of risk that they want to set for an economy. And I teased them. I said, well, you should do an op-ed on that. And they smiled on me. And I think that's very unlikely that we'll see that op-ed this side of a general election. But it's a really good question. And I think it applies to London. It applies to Brussels. It applies to Washington, D.C., or any of these other major markets. What level of risk do policymakers want to allow to create investment, to create opportunity?
Can I just add to that? I mean, I think, one of the things that regulators and central banks are very good at doing is actually acting in a way that's counter-cyclical and trying to bring that sort of tension into the system.
Give an example of that.
Well, so I can see Sarah in the front row. Bank of England will set counter-cyclical capital buffers. In other words, at the moment when the economy is getting tight, actually there's capital there that can be released. You can do a very similar thing, I think, around conduct regulation and elsewhere in terms of thinking about innovation. And right now, we're in a world, as you've set out very clearly, where everybody's kind of a bit risk off, and actually caution is the name of the game. How much do you want to try and make sure that you're fostering innovation during that period as a deliberate, conscious decision to try and offset some of what's going on out there, as well as all the very sensible things you'd do from a regulatory perspective about trying to, minimise risk, ensure people have got the right cyber controls, all of those kinds of questions.
Yeah.
You know
Jessica,
what?
do you want to come in?
Yeah, I think that this all ties back to the infrastructure as well that exists already in any one of the countries that we're looking at with elections underway. So with such a wide range of jurisdictions heading to the polls, you have to think about the kind of the three different priorities that I think show up oftentimes in FinTech investment or just in the development. And one is a country is either thinking about regulation first, it's thinking about technical standard setting first, or it's thinking about investment and capability building. And I think you see each country prioritize those three pieces in a different order, depending on what infrastructure it already has and the level of risk it's willing to take. And I think that will explain a lot of how we see development happen and investment happen in some of the technologies we're looking at.
How do you think that could change in the U.S. given the political uncertainty?
To change, I'd say that the U.S. Tends to do a lot of capacity building and investment in general. I think there are a number of bodies that definitely lead on a technical standard setting standpoint as well. NIST, for instance, both around AI and around quantum. I think that the U.S. tends to not be as fast to rush to regulate as perhaps in the EU. Where you've seen a preponderance of regulations in the last number of years that now are in the implementation phase going forward. And I think that there's an important balance there where in order to support growth, we need to be thoughtful about just how quickly we rush to very specific regulations as to principles-based, which is fairly common here in the UK, I think, to take a principles approach.
So this balance is absolutely critical. And let's be very selfish and talk about London and the UK right now.
We're sitting here, so we might as well.
We're sitting here, so we may as well. The balance that is struck by the next government and by the mandate, and there will be a tweak mandate, we hear it, for the regulatory system is absolutely vital. I think everybody in this room wants to get that right because we want we want to be celebrating, Janine, in 10 years' time, the fact that we've continued to grow. But the balance that we strike is vital ahead.
I couldn't think of better words to end on than those right there from Iain. Thank you very much to Iain, to Chris, and to Jessica for joining us to discuss the 40-plus elections around the world, billions of people going to the polls, and what it means for financial services and FinTech. Thank you very much.